How did a land of independent nations become the most powerful country the world has ever seen? In just a few centuries, the ground we now call the United States went from mound cities and cliff dwellings to skyscrapers, aircraft carriers, and a flag planted on the moon. This is that entire story, start to finish, in one video. 6 European empires fought over this soil. 13 nervous colonies broke away from a king. A civil war nearly split the country in half, and 2 world wars turned it into a superpower. I went back through historical documents and used advanced AI to reconstruct the full history of the United States. Long before any European arrived, North America was home to millions of people. Along the Mississippi rose Cahokia, a city of earthen pyramids whose largest, Monk's Mound, still stands taller than a 10-story building. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built stone cliff dwellings like those at Mesa Verde, stacked right into the canyon walls. In the Northeast, 5 nations governed themselves together under the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. These were farmers, traders, and diplomats who had shaped the land for thousands of years. The first Europeans to reach these shores left almost nothing behind. Around the year 1000, a Norse crew led by Leif Erikson sailed from Greenland and built a cluster of sod houses at L'Anse aux Meadows on the tip of Newfoundland, ruins you can still walk through today. They lasted only a few years before the cold and distance drove them off. There is something almost eerie about how completely that contact vanished. For nearly 500 years, Europe had no idea the continent was even there. The next Europeans to arrive would not disappear so quietly. In October 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, made landfall in the Caribbean while hunting for a route to Asia. He never reached the North American mainland and died believing he had found the edge of the Indies. The continents ended up named instead for a later navigator, Amerigo Vespucci, whose maps argued this was an entirely new landmass. What followed was one of the worst demographic collapses in recorded history. European ships carried smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases the people here had no immunity against, and epidemics raced ahead of the settlers themselves, wiping out whole communities before most had ever seen a European face. By some estimates, the indigenous population fell by as much as 90% over the next century. Against that backdrop, the Spanish pushed north, founding St. Augustine in Florida in 1565, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in what is now the United States. The English tried and failed at Roanoke, where an entire colony vanished sometime after 1587, leaving only the word Croatoan carved into a post and a mystery no one has ever solved. England finally gained a permanent foothold in 1607, building a wooden fort on a swampy stretch of the James River in Virginia and naming it Jamestown. The early years were brutal. Colonists searched for gold and found starvation instead, surviving only because Captain John Smith forced them to plant crops and trade with the Powhatan. What saved Jamestown was tobacco, the green rose of it spreading across Virginia and turning the colony into a cash machine. In 1619, an English ship sold roughly 24 captive Africans to the settlement, the start of more than 2 centuries of slavery. 13 years later, a very different group landed in the north. The Pilgrims who stepped off the Mayflower at Plymouth in 1620 came for religious freedom, and before going ashore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, agreeing to govern themselves. Further south, the Dutch built a walled trading town at the tip of Manhattan called New Amsterdam, its windmills and harbor busy with fur and cargo. The defensive wall they raised still carries its name today, Wall Street. When English warships sailed in and demanded surrender in 1664, the Dutch gave up without a fight, and New Amsterdam became New York. Meanwhile, the French pushed down the Mississippi and founded New Orleans in 1718. By the 1700s, the whole continent had become a chessboard for European rivalries. Britain, France, and Spain claimed vast, blurry stretches of land and dotted the frontier with wooden forts, and their colonists and native allies fought over borders that existed mostly on paper. The last and largest of these wars began, improbably, with a young Virginia officer named George Washington. In 1754, sent to push the French out of the Ohio Valley, his men ambushed a French patrol and lit the fuse on a global war. It became the French and Indian War in America, and the 7 Years' War everywhere else. British troops stormed the cliffs at Quebec and broke French power in North America, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 handed Britain almost the entire eastern half of the continent. One captured French outpost, Fort Duquesne, was renamed and grew into the city of Pittsburgh. The colonists celebrated. What none of them saw coming was the bill. Britain had won an empire and gone deep into debt to do it, and London decided the colonies should help pay it back. The taxes themselves were never the real problem. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act asked for modest sums, but Parliament had never asked the colonists first, and a legislature 3,000 miles away taxing them directly felt like a theft of their rights. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. Resistance turned physical fast. Mobs called the Sons of Liberty tarred tax collectors and tore apart officials' homes. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd on a Boston street and killed 5 men, an event printed and spread as the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, colonists disguised as Mohawk men rowed out into Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of British tea into the water, the Boston Tea Party. Britain slammed the port shut in response. By the time the first shots cracked across the green at Lexington in April 1775, there was almost nothing left to negotiate. A year into the fighting, the colonies stopped asking for reconciliation. On July 4, 1776, in a red brick hall in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted mostly by Thomas Jefferson. The words were soaring. The war was not. Washington spent years dragging a ragged, freezing, half-starved army through winters like Valley Forge, losing more battles than he won. The tide turned when France joined the American side. In 1781, a trapped British army surrendered at Yorktown, and the Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the United States as a free country. Winning the war proved easier than running the country. The first attempt at government nearly collapsed, so in 1787, delegates returned to that same Philadelphia Hall, now called Independence Hall, and wrote the Constitution that still governs the country today. It took effect in 1789 with Washington as the first president. Here is the part that makes it ironic. The same document that built the world's most durable republic also counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, a contradiction the country would eventually settle in blood. With independence secured, the country exploded outward. In 1803, Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France for about $15 million, doubling the nation in a single stroke, and sent Lewis and Clark to walk the length of it. Wagon trains soon rolled west by the thousands, under a slogan called Manifest Destiny. War with Mexico from 1846 to 1848 added California and the entire Southwest, and when gold turned up in the California hills, San Francisco swelled from a village into a boomtown almost overnight. That growth came at a brutal cost to the people already there. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, and other nations off their homelands and drove them west along what the Cherokee called the Trail of Tears, where thousands died on the road. And every new territory reopened the question the founders had dodged: slave or free? Each new state threatened the balance in Congress, and a string of fragile compromises held the Union together until, by 1860, the argument over slavery had grown too big for any deal to hold. The breaking point came with one election. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, 11 Southern states walked out to form the Confederacy, and in April 1861, Their guns opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War that followed was the deadliest in American history. At least 620,000 soldiers died, more than the country would lose in both world wars combined, on battlefields like Gettysburg that swallowed thousands in a single afternoon. Lincoln recast the war as a fight to end slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and after 4 years the Confederacy collapsed, its capital at Richmond left in smoking ruins. Days after the surrender, Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater in Washington. The years after the war, called Reconstruction, tried to rebuild the South and bring 4 million freed people into full citizenship. 3 amendments ended slavery and gave black men the vote, and for a brief window, black Americans held office across the South. Then it was abandoned. When federal troops pulled out in 1877, white Southern governments built the wall of segregation known as Jim Crow. The war settled whether the country would stay whole. Out of the wreckage came an industrial explosion. In 1869, 2 railroad crews met at Promontory, Utah, and drove a golden spike, linking the coasts by rail for the first time. Steel mills and oil refineries built fortunes for men like Carnegie and Rockefeller, and packed cities with immigrant workers crammed into tenements. This was the Gilded Age, thin gold over deep inequality. The skyline itself changed. The Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883. The Statue of Liberty rose in the harbor in 1886. And the first steel skyscrapers began climbing over Chicago and New York. Newcomers arrived by the millions through Ellis Island, which opened in 1892. The same expansion crushed the last independent native nations in the West, ending with the massacre of hundreds of Lakota at Wounded Knee in 1890. Then the country turned outward. A quick war with Spain in 1898 handed the United States an overseas empire from Puerto Rico to the Philippines. And when the First World War tore Europe apart, America entered in 1917 and tipped the balance. What strikes me about this stretch is how modern it suddenly feels. The billionaires, the tenements, the fights over immigration, and who the boom was really for. We are still having every one of them. That victory kicked off a decade that roared. The economy boomed, cities filled with cars and radios, and in 1920, women finally won the vote nationwide with the 19th Amendment. Then it all came apart. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and the Great Depression threw a quarter of the workforce out of work. President Franklin Roosevelt answered with the New Deal, a sweeping expansion of government that built dams and highways, created Social Security, and changed what Americans expected their government to do for them. The Depression only truly ended when the country went to war. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor, pulling the United States into the Second World War on 2 fronts at once. American factories converted to war production on a scale nobody had ever attempted, turning out ships and aircraft faster than the enemy could destroy them. Troops landed at Normandy on D-Day in 1944 and pushed into Germany the next spring, and the war ended in the Pacific in August 1945 when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing well over 100,000 people and opening the nuclear age. When the shooting stopped, most of the industrial world lay in ruins. The United States stood almost untouched, holding half the planet's manufacturing capacity and a monopoly on the most powerful weapon ever built. What gets me is the whiplash of it. 20 years from breadlines to the most powerful country on Earth, and the thing that flipped the switch was a war that killed 60 million people. That dominance froze almost immediately into a standoff. The Cold War pitted the United States against the Soviet Union, 2 giants with enough nuclear weapons to end the world several times over. They never fought each other directly, clashing instead through proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam and a race to build bigger bombs and better rockets. That same race put Americans on the moon. In July 1969, a 36-story Saturn V rocket lifted Apollo 11 off a Florida launch pad. and Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface as the whole planet watched. At home, the country was forced to face the promises it had broken. The civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge at Selma and filled the National Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial, winning the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Cold War itself ended not with a battle, but with exhaustion. In 1989, crowds tore down the Berlin Wall with hammers, and by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union had dissolved, leaving the United States as the only superpower left standing. That certainty shattered on a clear September morning. On September 11, 2001, hijacked planes brought down the Twin Towers in New York, killing nearly 3,000 people and pulling the country into 2 long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that dragged on far longer than anyone expected. At the same time, a digital revolution poured out of Silicon Valley, putting a computer in every pocket and turning a handful of American companies into some of the most powerful on Earth. Then in 2008, a financial crash that started on Wall Street spread around the globe. The country today is still the world's largest economy and its strongest military, printing the currency much of the planet runs on. It is also as divided against itself as it has been since the Civil War, arguing over inequality, power, and whether its long run at the top can last. That tension is old. This is a nation that wrote, "All men are created equal," while holding people in chains, that promised liberty and delivered it unevenly. And that has kept falling short of its own ideals, and then, slowly and at great cost, being forced to close the gap. And the story is still being written. In a few short centuries, a continent of independent nations became 13 colonies, then a fragile republic, then a divided country that nearly destroyed itself, and finally the most powerful nation on Earth. None of it ran smoothly, and almost none of it was clean. The land was taken, the labor was often forced, and nearly every step forward came out of conflict or war. The America we recognize today was built on top of all of it, the triumphs and the crimes alike, and it is still arguing with itself about which parts to remember. If this is the kind of video you enjoy, hit subscribe and give this video a like, and let me know which country or period should I cover next. See you next time.